I spent almost 14 years working for a company that now regularly does in excess of $100 billion in revenue per year. And they're currently in the top 40 largest companies in the US, according to Forbes. And while I was there, I observed one thing they ruthlessly focused on, which was people. And in this episode, I'm going to share everything I learned about how to attract, hire, succession plan. I'll explain what that means, manage talent, and keep the best talent. And I'll share in the end why I think this is the reason for that company's success. So let's get right into it. What is going on, y'all? Welcome back to the show. My name is Ryan Rice. Thank you for tuning in to the place where we talk about business, real estate, and the monies. And I'm making this episode because I'm about to bring on a couple new people. And as a result, I'm constantly reminding myself how important people are when growing a business. And I reflect a lot on how big of a deal people were in the company I worked for previously. And I had a unique perspective because I got to be in the room where we planned talent moves across an arm of that business where we did over $4 billion in revenue per year. And I actually got exposure to talent planning across the whole company. And so we're going to cover what I learned from them in attracting, hiring, succession planning, which basically just means how long your current leadership will be in their current role and what role they will have next. What I learned about managing talent and keeping the best talent. So let's start with attracting talent. And I'm not going to say the name of the company because it doesn't really matter. And honestly, if you've listened to my stuff, you know who it is. But the point is not about which company it is. But how this company attracted talent was very much associated to their brand. They positioned themselves in the marketplace in comparison to their competitors as a more favorable place for their customer. It wasn't the, discount option. And because they positioned this way for their customer, they were able to also position this way for their employees as well. And because of this positioning, it attracted a different level of talent than a company in the same industry that had for example, a discount type of positioning. And so in your business, if you are not positioning yourself as the discount person, but are positioning yourself in terms of, your strategic advantage has something to do with the value that you deliver, whatever it might be, then you can use that to also attract good talent. And how I think the brand lesson applies to us, even let's say you're just starting a real estate investing company or a new business. How this applies to you in the beginning is the way that you are putting yourself out there, not just to your customer, but let's say you are doing social media or you are getting public Google reviews. You're establishing a brand. And as I just went through this interviewing journey where we interviewed well over 50 candidates, we had over 100 people apply to this position that I just hired for. A lot of the candidates in the interview process told me that they went and they did research on my company, and based on what they found, hint, that's my brand, then that was available to the public, they chose then to apply. They liked what they saw. They liked the brand that we were portraying. And as a result, they wanted to be a part of it. And I ruthlessly am protecting my brand. It's so important to me to make sure that all of the clients that we serve to our utmost capability. And ideally, they can go tell the public about that in a review. And one might not think about the impact to attracting talent to something like a customer review, but if that is your only public association while you're out there, then it's something that people are going to take into effect when they're applying to work for you. And mind you, this experience that I just shared where potential prospective employees were researching what I stood for and what my brand was, this was for an entry-level sales role. So imagine if you're hiring for a leadership position, what information does the public have about you out there? What is the brand that you are establishing? And is that a brand that is going to attract the type of people that you're going to need to grow your business? And I think that's an important question. And it's one, frankly, that I don't think a lot of people, when they're new, are really giving much thought to, because why would you, right? You have so many other things to worry about. You have a small person team, but everything you do that is out in the public is reflective of your brand, and it's going to impact who is willing to work for you. The next category of things that I learned from this company in regards to people was hiring people. And there's two pieces here with hiring. There's what I learned about the interview process, and then what I learned about the strategy of this company. So let's first talk about the interview process. When it came to interviewing for higher level leadership roles in this company, the process was insanely intense. So intense that months and months before a candidate was going to go to an interview, their boss would put them through like rigorous training on how to interview, how to tell your story. And what I found fascinating about this is I think it exemplifies how important preparation is when you want to do something big, or what you want to achieve something worth achieving. And so prior to interviewing for a promotion as a leader, there would typically be some sort of developmental program that you would go through. You would go through rigorous actual interview role play where you would practice telling your story to your boss. You might do the same thing with a peer. And then the actual interview itself, it was like, it could be intimidating. You might interview with 4 different, very, very high level leaders. And, these might be people who are running the entire $100 billion revenue company, maybe not the CEO, but maybe a level or 2 below them. And it could be pretty intimidating. And I think how we can apply in our small fried businesses that we are currently running, what can we take from the fact that they made interviews a big deal? Well, I think we can take just simply, even if we are hiring for an entry-level sales role, but especially when we're small, let's say we have 2 employees and we're going to 3, and which means we're increasing the size of our business by 50% in terms of headcount, then it's so important to put effort into the process to make sure that you're asking the right questions, to get the right candidate on board, and you're spending enough time assessing and analyzing each candidate. And so as I think about, for example, the process that I just went through to hire the role that we're bringing on, I probably spent just as much time preparing for those interviews process, making sure that, what questions did I want to ask? How many interviews did I need to have? Who did I want to have on the interview in terms of people on my team? How did I want to structure the questions? Which interview did I want to test which skill for? And then the next interview I wanted to test for this. And then which interview did I want to cover my values? I spent just as much time preparing for that interview as I did actually interviewing. And I think the reason I did that is because of all of the lessons I took in seeing the interview process at my previous company. And so if you've hired people, or maybe you are going to hire people, or maybe you hired someone and you're like, man, this is not good. It could be just because of your interview and hiring process. And if you spent a very, very small portion of time preparing to interview the candidate, just thinking that you'd be able to wing a conversation, and based on winging a conversation, assess someone's ability to do the job and then bring them on, and then surprise, surprise, they suck. Well, maybe something to consider in terms of just preparation. And by the way, side note, I did recently put out another podcast. I think it was about something about I interviewed a bunch of people. Here was my lesson. And so if you want to hear the exact interview framework that I used that was helpful for me to assess candidates, which I pulled from my previous job, then I do have that episode out there as well. Feel free to go check it out. But the next thing I learned from this company about hiring was what their strategy was. And they had a very unique strategy for hiring entry-level leadership and then developing that leadership into an above and beyond and into additional leadership roles. If I had to estimate the percentage of leaders that they hired directly out of college versus leaders that they hired with significant experience, I have no idea what it actually was, but I would probably guess 70% campus, 30% external with experience. And if it wasn't an entry-level leadership role, then as people continue to get new roles and would continue to, get promoted, that strategy or that ratio remained the same. In other words, a lot of the promotions were internal, and there were very little, higher-level leadership roles that were being filled with an external candidate. And what I learned from that was their entry-level leadership, why I think the strategy worked with bringing a campus recruit on, is because if they found someone who was hungry and wanted to learn, but didn't have the experience, but they were coachable and teachable and were driven, well, the company had the ability to teach the person the skills that they needed to continue to progress. And then they were so good at retaining the talent that an initial investment early in someone's career could turn into a 15, 20, 25-year career. There's so many stories about the highest level leaders in this company. They started as the lowest level, entry-level leader, or maybe even in some cases like not even a leadership role. And so what do I take from that? Again, that's one end of the spectrum. There's a $100 billion company. How do we apply that in our small fry company? Well, what I constantly think about is, I know a lot of real estate investors, for example, like when they hire a lead manager, for example, maybe they hire a VA in the Philippines, or maybe they hire whoever they hire. But the strategy when they're hiring someone is not to necessarily develop someone. You can't develop a VA in the Philippines into like a higher level leadership role for your company. Or at least, I won't say you can't. Maybe it's physically possible, but it's just going to be less likely. And so I am choosing to put people in that role that I would like to see, or maybe who have potential to grow into a closer position. And maybe that closer position has the potential to grow into a sales lead. And at some point, I'm going to need an operations manager. And it just goes on and on. And if I'm going to take the time to truly invest in an employee, I love the idea that employee has potential to do more and more and more. And that was very consistent in the strategy with this company. They loved bringing people on with potential. And even if they didn't have a current skill set that they thought might be able to get them, super high in the company, if they were driven and teachable, then they would bring them on and invest in their skills. And just the investment in skills alone would retain people, and it would, then get them promoted, and they would continue to get rewarded. So I think about that a lot, and I reflect on, just that was their strategy: bring on people, promote them internally, and you're still going to need some occasional external hires, or maybe experienced hires, but just an observation that seems to be working for them that I think about and apply to my business. Next is succession planning, which again, I'll define as just having a plan for how long is your leader going to be in this role, and what role is that leader going to serve in next, and how long are they going to be in that role. And what's fascinating about succession planning with this company is we put in significant resources to do succession planning. So for perspective, we would have quarterly meetings where millions and millions, probably tens of millions of dollars of payroll would sit in one room for 2 entire days. And all we would talk about is, okay, let's go down the list. We have leader A. How long has leader A been in this specific role? And okay, is that a role that we see leader A staying in? And how much longer do we see them staying in? Oh, we see leader A having potential for this next role. Okay, then who is going to backfill this person? And then, okay, that person's going to backfill that person. So that's going to create an opening over here. Who's going to fill that role? And it was just it's this big puzzle piece. And it was unbelievable for me to witness how much payroll went into that. And if a company who's doing $100 billion in revenue is putting in every single quarter, investing tens of millions of dollars of payroll into these meetings to determine where people are going to go and when they're going to go there, then I think there's something to learn from that. And now obviously the company was so big and there were so many of these leadership roles that any disruption or any holes in leadership would cause some significant issues. It could cause, serious revenue declines, which would be a profit hit, etc. And so, again, circling back to, okay, how does this apply to a small business? Well, even me, as I think about right now, I have me and 2 other full-time employees, and I'm bringing on 2 more. So I'm going to have, 5? There'll be 5 of us. And because I went through that experience at the previous company, I'm constantly thinking about, okay, I have a current employee who his wife just got pregnant with twins, and he's going to go out in the fall. And because of that, next week, I have this new employee starting, and there's going to be 2 months of overlap. And the reason why there's going to be 2 months of overlap, I think, is because I took the succession planning lessons that I learned, and I was like, okay, well, I know how painful it is when there is a gap in employment or we're missing a certain role. Let me make sure that I build a plan that can make that can not only ensure that there's no gap, but maybe even that there's some overlap. And I think that's how we can apply early on. Even if you have 1 or 2 or 3 employees, and even if they're relatively low level, let's say they're not leadership roles, if you have 3 employees and you lose one of them, or even if you have 5 employees and you lose one of them, even if you have 10 employees and you lose one of them, I mean, you are going to feel that. And if you're a business owner who's felt that before, man, it can be really painful. Because who's going to fill in that gap? Well, typically it's the business owner, and the business owner's already wearing 20 hats. Okay, well, might as well wear 21 during this, while we have this employee gap. And so I know this one may be tough to apply this big, succession planning lesson to a small business, but I do think we can apply the principles and the concepts and understand that even if the roles are lower level roles, having a plan to make sure that we don't have gaps in those roles is going to prevent the business from declining if any sort of employee issue pops up. Next is managing talent. And when I say manage talent, I basically mean performance management. If someone is not performing, what do you do? And, what's funny is the company they were pretty regimented in terms of the process. Now, I think there were a lot of gaps in terms of how to execute the process, but I think that's normal because it's hard to performance manage people. But the process itself is you would go on what's called a performance improvement plan. And a performance improvement plan was basically 90 days long. And it should never be a surprise, right? But someone is not performing and you put them on this performance improvement plan. And because of all of the prior conversations that have been taking place, it's not a surprise that you're putting them on this performance improvement plan. And this thing is it's not just you in a room having a conversation with the poor performing employee, and then the employee walks out. I mean, this is a written multiple page document that has listed out all of the things all of the reasons why the person isn't performing, and then listed out all of the things that employee needs to do in order to turn their performance around. And then there would be weekly check-ins. And if after the 30-day point, the individual was not performing, then it would go to like the next step. And after the 60-day point, it would go to the next step. And basically, if it got to the point where there was 90 days, then like the person essentially knew they were going to get fired. And so what do I take from that and apply to our business? How do we apply those learnings to ours? Well, I think first and foremost, if you are having performance management conversations, say, quarterly or like an annual review, and if that's the only time that you're talking to your employee about their performance and whether or not, how they're doing, you're articulating to them where they stand, then that is a big issue. That's not performance management. It's so important for an employee to always know where they stand, and how they always know where they stand is you are just constantly giving them feedback. And it should never be a surprise if somebody is performing poorly, because you just talk to them all, that you give them real-time feedback. Now, we're not going to talk about how to give real-time feedback or how to respectfully, manage talent. I have done some other podcast episodes on that you can go search for. But always talking to your employee about their performance, I think, is really, really important. How I do that, I have weekly one-on-ones with each of my employees. We go over, what went well, what do they need help with. I'm very clear on what it is that they want to accomplish. And I consistently am asking questions of trying to figure out how I can get them to where they want to go. And I give very real-time feedback. And then the last way I think we apply this is, look, if you have someone on your team and they're not performing, 90 days is really like the longest amount of time that you want to give them. If they're brand new and it's like a trial period, then you can just cut them at that point. But the longer someone who's not performing stays at your business, the more toxic it is. The harder it is for your business to improve. They're taking up so much mental energy from you. They're requiring your attention when your attention needs to be spent focused on the business. And so if someone's not performing, managing them or setting an expectation and following up on that expectation and doing so max 90 days is going to ensure that you hold your talent bar to the highest level. And then lastly, keeping the best talent. What I noticed about this company, I've mentioned this already, but the company was great at everywhere I went. It was, this person's been with this company for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, moving up the ranks, doing all these different, roles. And the company put so much effort into retaining talent. And there's multiple ways they did this. One was through development programs, which I meant already when I say development, just if a leader saw potential in another leader, then that person would get selected to go maybe spend time with peers or spend time with people who were doing the next role so that they could learn more, maybe get exposure to higher level leadership. And they would put these employees through these development programs, and it would be this big recognition. If you got selected to go through the development program, it was a big deal. And, they made them fun, and you get exposure to like really high level people in the company. And it was just this really cool experience. And so it wasn't just a development program, but it was an experience for those candidates. And I thought that was really neat. Another way they retain talent is constantly promoting them. And so if someone had high potential, it was expected that probably every 18 months to 2 years, that person was going to be promoted. And if you're constantly promoted and you're constantly being challenged and trying something new and the promotions are bringing you more money, well, that's going to keep you retained, right? If, of course, that's what you want, right? But how they retain people with high potential is they would just constantly put these promotional opportunities in front of them, give them opportunities to learn. And of course, every step of the way, they're making more and more money. And that goes along with pay. So another way they retain people is they paid really well. And I don't know that they paid like excessive in compared to the industry, but the pay was strong. And honestly, part of the reason why I stayed there so long and didn't start a business sooner was because of how much they were paying me. Another way they retain talent was through restricted stock units, or RSUs. And essentially what that was is they would give an employee, say, $40,000 in stocks, and those stocks would vest over the course of 4 years. And so, if you performed really well this year, they'd give you 40 grand, but you don't get the 40 grand until your 4th year is complete. And that is going to entice people to stay, right? Let's say 5 years in a row, you got 40 grand each. Well, that's 200 grand. Now, by the end of the 5th year, you got to stay with the company for 9 years before they all vest. But still, it's $200,000 that's attractive. That's how they would retain people. All right, so how do we apply this to our small business? Well, I think the biggest principle there is how much the company invested in their talent. I mean, there were significant resources. These development programs were expensive. They would fly people places. They had people running these programs, which meant time away from the business. The money and the restricted stock units and all of the promotional. I mean, there was so much mental energy in the company about how can we invest in our people. And I think how we can apply that even when we're small is, if you are the hiring manager, are you thinking about your employees and how you can develop and invest in them, like in your shower time, for example? And if you're not, then maybe the person who's leading your team, or in the future, maybe you need to learn how to think about that stuff in your shower time, or maybe have plans to bring on someone that can run the operation so that they're thinking about those things in their shower time. But it was such a good testament for how important it is to invest in your people. And the cliche term that I hear all the time is, well, what if you invest in your people and they leave? And the cliche response is, well, what if you don't and they stay? Right? So I truly believe, based on that experience I had, that you retaining your top talent is going to be in direct correlation with how much effort and time that you spend investing in your team. And that could be, on a weekly basis, for example. It could be, okay, what's the one thing I could do this week that is going to help move this employee closer to where it is that they want to go? And on a longer time horizon, it could be challenging them, making sure that you're giving consistent feedback. But that investment is just really important. And that's how I'm applying what I learned from retaining talent at that big company into my small company. So the reason why I think all of these things I just went through and the general focus on people is the reason for this company's success is because I always noticed when things went wrong in that company, it was always attributable to a single person. We could always tie it back to one person. And when things were exceptional, there was always an exceptional leader present. And that was pretty eye-opening to me. And the more and more I'm exposed to entrepreneurs, the more I see that the best businesses have the highest bar for talent. And they have a very deliberate strategy for attracting it. And I'll give an example recently, and then I'll wrap this up. Recently, my wife and I, and some of you may know this, we went out to Las Vegas for an Acquisition.com workshop, which, if you don't know what that is, it's put on by Alex and Layla Hormozi. If you don't know who they are, they run they run a business that does hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue per year, and they're like in their 30s, and they're worth a whole lot of money. And something I notice about their room is, man, there were some really, really talented people in that room. And it is directly attributable that there's two leaders in their early 30s running a company that's doing hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and the room is just full of absolutely exceptional talent. And I think that's telling enough. And so hopefully this was convincing enough that all of these stories and all of these lessons that I just went through, it's convincing enough for you to take people seriously. Maybe you should be selective about who you hire. Maybe you should put effort and invest in your talent. Maybe you should have a strategy for brand, how to retain them. And if everything I went through wasn't convincing enough, well, yeah, I don't know what I can do for you. But I hope that was helpful for you. If it was, if that was useful, if you could share this, send it to a friend who has a business, maybe is thinking about a business, or just send it to someone who you think may find this useful. That would mean a ton. That's the only way this podcast grows. And I'm trying more and more to make these more and more useful for you guys. So I appreciate you guys listening. Hope you got some value, and I'll see you in the next one.